Hi, I'm Patric Palm, CEO and founder of Favro, and this is the Learn from Leaders podcast. The background to these interviews is that Favro clients are some of the most innovative and agile businesses out there. And it's used for collaborative planning by marketing teams, by product teams, HR, management teams. And what this means is that we get to know some truly inspiring people. So what we do in this podcast is that I invite them here for a conversation about something where they are true leaders, so we can all learn from it. Let's go. And we are live with Brian Graham. How's it going?
Going well, thank you. How are you, Patric?
Yeah, not too bad. I'm not in Vilnius right now. I'm in Sweden, in Uppsala. And what about you?
Over in Texas. Not on the set of Jimmy Fallon.
All right, cool. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. You are at Hypixel today, but you've been doing so many different things over the years. And I think the first time we met, you were at EA Sports in Orlando. That's right.
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So maybe we can start just a little bit with how did you get into game development in the first place? What made you stay? What made you so focused on production management and production leadership? I think it would be great for anyone who doesn't already know you.
Sure. It's interesting. I started off as a programmer for Motorola and telecoms. I'll say several previous lives ago. I won't throw out a number. And while the job was fine, moved into more project management. I felt like a number, and I felt like it was just moving tasks around for the sake of producing charts. And I was young at the time and didn't really know what I wanted. I just knew I wanted something more. And I did an application on monster.com at the time. There was a gaming studio with EA in Orlando that they were sort of a little mysterious. They didn't specifically say it was EA, and they didn't say it was gaming. They sort of touched around it. I applied thinking, because I don't have gaming experience at the time, that there's no way that they'll reach out to me. Opportunity knocked, and they did. Had interviews. 2 weeks later, I accepted a job offer, packed up my stuff, sold my house from Illinois, and moved down to Florida. And I remember when I started there, they said, "Why did you want to move?" I said, "Well, I wanted a challenge." And they said, "Well, welcome to the games industry. That's all you have is nothing but challenges." Started off as a development manager for the Madden 06 series. And over that time, more opportunities presented itself. And that's when Xbox 360 was being developed. And our current size of the team at that point that I was on was 15. And we produced the title for the PlayStation 2, Xbox, and the GameCube, all three with 15 people. As the 360 was being developed, we had a separate team that was working on that for the Xbox 360. That team grew to 220 people. So at that time, EA went from 15, not scaling easily or evolving. They went right from 15 to 220 and realized that, hey, the way that you manage teams of 15 people and products that have that size staffing doesn't carry over when you have 220 people, multiple floors, multiple locations. That development director had left. They asked me to take that over to try and get it shipped. Lived there for 8 months, and then we shipped it, and then I took over the Madden franchise from the development perspective from Madden 6 through Madden 9, and then moved into overseeing the development for all of EA Sports from like a portfolio management perspective and studio operations of working with first party like Sony and Microsoft. After about 10 years at EA, had an opportunity to go work with Magic Leap in Florida for mixed reality. Amazing concept, and they still have products that's still being released. I was there for a couple of years helping to set up their content creation studios. When there was an opportunity out here in Central Texas for a studio called Playful, which was founded by the creator of Words with Friends, and very family-oriented type of studio development types of games. And it was an amazing time over 3 years doing PC online titles, looking at Switch titles, stuff like that. And most recently was brought in over here at Hypixel Studios, which is we're a fully remote studio, and we're developing the game Hightail. And I'm, from the production perspective, looking at things from the more of the operational side of how do we scale up responsibly and how do we get the this large ambitious title done well. I think I've always liked the problem solving from the operational side of, hey, I know this works well, but there's a better way or a more efficient way. And at the end of the day, I've seen several products, and I've been in charge of several products where I've made these mistakes, where I've done things in a way that that felt good on paper or in a schedule, but the end result product wasn't as good as what we wanted. And that's when I moved heavily into more of agile frameworks at that time. And that's sort of been my mainstay to this date.
So one question I'm curious about, taking this story is, apart from simply the scale of things in terms of number of people, what have you seen over these years kind of also change when it comes to production management? I mean, we talk about the pure scale, which of course affects. You mentioned agile. I think when we met the first time, this was let's say more new, and today very established. It's more about maybe doing it well rather than doing it. But just it would be interesting just kind of get a couple of your views on things that have changed. Like how was it to be in production management 15 years ago versus 7, 5, and now
It's interesting. There's I'll say a lot of things on the outside that have changed. People are there's a lot of things that stay consistent. For example, people are still people. People still think they're good at estimations, and they're not. It's just like there's just universal truths that happen. I think the biggest change, at least from the gaming side of production, has been more from an industry side, where the expectations of gaming have gone from, we package things on a disc, we put it out, we put out some patches, and we sort of move on from there, working on the next version. They've moved to this live service where things are expected to live forever and be produced forever. And that's a very different publishing and production model, mainly because you don't have this finite time that you can plan to. It's something that you're now making trade-offs as, well, we'll get to this one later, as opposed to it's not going to make it in the version at all. Internally, though, there have been tons of, I'll say, adaptations of Agile, different types of frameworks that have been published. I think a lot of people are becoming a lot more experienced at understanding what it means. But in general, I think there's still that foundational problem of really understanding why certain components in Agile exist, not just what they mean, even to this day.
It's interesting what you said there with going from shipping a disk to something which is live. One observation that we made, I kind of want to bounce that with you. Hopefully you don't disagree. But what I've seen, what we've seen and been writing a little bit about is that some of the challenges that comes with this are becoming more and more understood, on a team level. And one of the very new things, and I would say actually very recent, is that more, let's say, a publishing level, kind of a portfolio level, these things are starting to be more understood, and they're starting to be, okay, well, this actually changes also some things on how we do things, on that level. I mean, Favro is not an old company. We started this in 2016, but in the beginning, it was definitely only kind of teams, that were talking with us. It was all about, being more productive. But now people are interested in talking about stuff that has to do with more agile production, also on a much more senior level. Well, firstly, do you agree? And secondly, if so, it would be interesting kind of hear a little bit of your views on what you're seeing on that kind of level.
Yeah, I do agree. I think that there's always been the need at the senior level for that view, and the I'll say the portfolio management side of things. I think it's just been supplied in the past in different ways, either status reports that people compile or put together. And over time, at least my opinion is, I think that as tools have become a little bit more prevalent and more accessible, that people have realized that a lot of the management from that portfolio side is really valuable to see almost in real time, and not so much hey, I need you to get me a status report every Thursday that I may or may not read because it may or may not be in the format that I want. And as those tools have become more accessible and easy to produce, I think that there has been a rise, I'll say, in expectations from the more senior levels to take a look at things from this more holistic view. One of the big things and big changes that you get going from traditional project management into agile is looking at things not in terms of just particular metrics, but you're looking at things in terms of leading indicators. And that's one of the biggest mind shifts when you're looking at like agile framework transitions. And going for a portfolio view, that's essential, right? Now that the studio or the sub teams are looking at things from this leading indicator perspective, it makes it easier to boil that up for senior management to understand what are those gauges that they need to be monitoring as well.
Cool. So let's jump into the meat of the conversation. I'm gonna read out the themes. I don't get it wrong. So like do's and don'ts of building a sustainable foundation for developing great games. Do's and don'ts there is pretty straightforward, right? But there's two words there that I think we need. I kind of want to focus a bit on. So one, sustainable, and foundation. So before getting deep into your views here, what do we mean by foundation here? Just so we have everyone aligned.
So for me, when I use the term foundational, it's really about, I'll say, the slow part of setting up teams from a project management perspective that traditionally people don't have a ton of patience for, because it's a lot of trial and error. So for example, one of the things that I look at doing is making sure that, one, not only do we understand as we're bringing teams up from an agile methodology, it's not just the training, say, hey, or do this, do that. This is why you do a burn down. This is separation of backlogs, priority. But it's really the push of having people understand why those things exist is the most important part of that, not necessarily the actual task itself. So for me, foundational is making sure that when we set up teams to start working, typically do it in an evolutionary manner where we start with a piece, I'll say, of if we're running Scrum, not the full thing yet, where they're actually starting and stopping, and most importantly, making mistakes. Now we're making changes based on those mistakes, and the experiential reference lasts a lot longer than just someone saying, here, we've rolled out a way to do it, follow this guideline. That foundation is making sure that those teams are running things in a methodology way that produces, I'll say, an outcome with integrity that we can use to propagate into that larger roadmap. So like if we use points for velocity and story points, I've had teams before where you tell them this is how you have to run it, and they're just pushing to close off story points, and they make their burn down charts because they push in the team, they close off things, making exceptions because that's what you're saying is important. The problem with that is now that number has an asterisk next to it, and you're not so sure, does this truly mean what you were able to do? Or is it just an indicator of what we've been focused on and you made it look good? A sustainable foundation is one that you don't have that asterisk with it, is one that, hey, you did 0 points, but there were a reason. Okay, let's move on. You're not being beaten over the head for 0 or low amount of points. Once you have that established as the foundation, and you know you can rely on the metrics and the information that's coming out of those teams, then you can build that next layer of that tower, right? Which is the portfolio mapping and starting to link a bunch of those things together.
You said outcome integrity. Can you just elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah. So I'll use an example of past that I'm sure if people have been in project management for a while are used to have to produce these Gantt charts almost a year out into a project, down to 8 hours, 2-day increments. And from a creative perspective, from a game perspective, it never held true to me that how are we able to schedule out at 8-hour tasks a year from now? We don't, like, no one can say what fun is going to be a year from now. Like, that's just not how fun is made. It's not developed in a design doc. You execute that document and boom, fun happens. And to me, those metrics and that schedule that we were doing to that level of granularity didn't have a lot of integrity to it, mainly because, like, I looked at it, I'm like, this doesn't help me at all. It may make someone else feel better, like maybe at the next level, but it's all sort of made up in a way. And when I look at those things, from like directing production on an operational level, I want to make sure that the stuff that's being produced and the artifacts that are being produced are actually useful when I sum them all together to see where we're going as a product. And when I look at the old way that I was told to do it a long time ago, like, that value of the output of that, I don't have any integrity in or feeling of integrity in those numbers, because I don't feel like I can rely on them. I feel like it was just an artifact put together to please a meeting as opposed to get us somewhere. So when I'm talking about integrity of outcome, I'm looking for the fact that the numbers that are being or the artifacts that are being produced by these teams is something that I feel is very valid to be able to extract some future projections with.
So, I find this very interesting, and my question would be, what's hard and not, with building this foundation. I mean, for example, I can imagine that, you always have this, it's the same thing as, when you're, say you're bringing, venture capital money, into startup, everyone wants to get started with things like quick, you want the results like tomorrow or yesterday. And it, you want to also, build a foundation to build a great company, right? And I think it's very similar to what you're describing. That so how do you? Well, two questions. And so one, just generally, what's hard with this? The kind of the traps along the way, and secondly, I'm very curious about the specific challenge of time there. Everyone's like hungry for, let's get some results quickly here, and at the same time, you want to build that foundation, because I think it's pretty clear, the value of creating that foundation from what you said, but how do you make it happen?
There's no specific blueprint that's going to work for everybody, but a lot of it relies on the culture of the organization, your timelines as an organization, like you mentioned. I think that we, especially in games, I can speak to, we want to see results as fast as possible because we want to iterate on those things. That's fantastic, and we have methodologies to support that when the methodologies are implemented and are working. So the analogy I sort of always have used in the past is that we'll put some frameworks together to see if this is the way that we want to produce our title, and that works. But we'll do a prototype of it. So we're putting a foundation of a house, like maybe we'll use toothpicks for now. And then we say, yeah, that held, and we could do one level. Yeah, this seems to work. Then the impatience of the studio, because they've seen some results, is typically okay, now just do level 2. Well, the problem is once you start getting up to level 3, everything collapses and you have to go and rework everything. And that will really show itself from, you're going to have a lot of people working in the teams that, the whole term, feel like they're herding cats all the time, because a lot of the foundational aspects that take some time to sink in. And that time is very experiential on the people that are running the team, because a lot of Agile is really about that team and how they work together. You can't force that and say, well, just read this book, do it within one sprint, you're good. It takes some time to start and stop. So you need to have some patience and expect that, hey, the first several deliveries out of these sprints, it's the focus isn't so much on the deliveries of what they produced, it's more focused on how they're producing it, so that you can start backing off a little bit. And now it's sort of this black box where if I have a backlog, it's prioritized and it's feeding into this system, I know that they're going to run this science experiment correctly and give us a result. Agile is just, for me anyway, always this sort of big science experiment, where what we focused on an operational side is making sure that the experiments are consistently run with a standard and run well. The results may be a failure, but that's an accurate result because I know the parameters of the experiments have been done well before. And that takes a lot of patience and understanding that, hey, it might be a couple months before we see something that's of value. Now, in organizations that have a lot of time, that's okay. In organizations that have to turn around quickly, a lot of impatience comes in, and you sort of have to figure out, how do you do this in a hybrid manner?
So please talk more about that. How do you do it in that hybrid manner? Because I think a lot of people right now are like, it's almost like cliffhanger there. It's like, because this is the situation so many are facing.
Yeah. From teams before that I've worked on, if I go back to, let's say, I'm more on the packaged good days, where a lot of people don't realize, like, the sports titles that we did through EA, since they come out annually, we only have several months of production, and it's the same team, so they have to turn around quickly, get into a pre-pro, figure out what's going to be there. There is some parallel overlap work between years, but for the most part, we have a few months, to develop. It's very quick. So when we started doing the Agile transition, I couldn't say, hey, we're not going to deliver a product next year because we're working on our foundation. So what we did was we took a couple teams that I felt had some fairly senior leaders that understood more of the Agile frameworks a little bit more than some others. And we started with 1 or 2 teams for that cycle. And the idea was for the other teams to sort of learn from them to learn from themselves, knowing that we were going to get some outputs from them that were going to be valid regardless, because of the leadership that I had on them. And then the next year, that's when we sort of onboarded everyone into that framework. So we were able to sort of merge it together, as opposed to saying, okay, everyone try it first for a little while and then move on. We just picked a couple and then started evolving from there.
So one question I have, I mean, there's a bit of a convergence, between different kinds of media right now. I think we can say, in many ways. We talked about going from like a disc to live, and in some aspects, I think this is happening also very much between various mediums. But just generally speaking, the kind of convergence that happens between various media today, the fact that games today is just so much bigger than it was 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think this will affect? I mean, just to kind of throw you one example of what I'm kind of like hinting at is, in our industry, this been for a long time. We're kind of looking at Hollywood and we're taking inspiration from there. But right now, I think we're seeing much more, the other direction happening as well. I mean, just generally, how do you see, production management changing over time, in the future? based upon the conversion of various media, but maybe also other factors that plays in here.
It's interesting, the models with television and movies, and I have tangential knowledge. Obviously, I haven't been working specifically in that industry. I have a lot of contacts that do, so we compare and contrast sort of the differences between them all the time. One of the biggest struggles within, if we talk about like a movie production, that's very different than typical games development, is that everyone is contract labor typically, and you exist for that. Everyone's together and then they depart. Whereas a lot of game development is mostly teams that have, are structured and can evolve together, so they have a little bit more longevity to it. I think where we are starting to see some convergence has been because of the pandemic, where now that there's so much more remote work than there was before, forced a lot of companies to really invest in remote, and realizing, oh, this is something that we can actually do. We're now much more geographically dispersed than we were. We're not all necessarily in the same place or the same time zone, which is more akin in some ways sometimes to some of the movie production. The interesting thing is, I think that has been the biggest shift that I have seen from a production perspective, because the way that you, as a producer, right, most of my stuff had always come from walking around, talking to people, a lot of body language and seeing where changes need to be made, what's working. When you're remote, you don't have that advantage anymore. It's a completely different set of tools, where now, like, you're trying to read tone in Slack messages or emails in black and white, which is almost near impossible to do. So the biggest, at least from my experience, shift that I've been seeing is, how do we structure to get these teams that feel homogenous together when they're not physically ever together? So that has, that's something that I'm still working on, trying to figure out. I don't know if anyone's ever perfected that yet, because there is an element of face-to-face and that human connection that you miss a little bit. I know here at Hypixel, one thing that we value and we've been looking at doing is every so often getting the teams together physically for a little bit, to try and restore that connection. But on top of that, we've seen from a production perspective that have to be a lot more specific, whereas in person, it was easier as a coach to sit back and help walk someone to where they're going to get to, because you had that time, whether you're in a meeting or whatever. Whereas in a remote majority environment, a lot of it tends to migrate to, okay, let me spin that on its head a little bit. I need you to get here. Now let me help you work there, as opposed to leading them. So for me anyway, that's a fairly big shift of how you're working with people. The methodologies themselves so far held up. From agile framework, actually, I've seen them help more so, because if you're doing Scrum correctly and it's a highly efficient team, and there's some limited dependencies between them, you can do a lot of the stuff asynchronously for a while, because everyone understands intent and everyone understands where they're trying to go to, versus the traditional older style way of management. It's like, you do this task, wait till I get an update, you do this task. No one really knows where that's moving to. So then you try and smash all these tasks together and hope that you have this greater output. And that it really hardly ever worked when you're in person, and it really doesn't work when you're remote, because you don't have that iteration as much as you did before.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, there was definitely a trend already before COVID, striving for high levels of autonomy, both team autonomy and individual autonomy. But then the goal was agility, being able to adapt to change. But I think COVID really accelerated that trend, because when you are remote, if you're not working in that way, it's going to be very, very painful. Yeah, I think that is definitely the direction for the future. And also we do the same at Favro. We do we call it on-sites instead of off-sites. So from time to time, just getting everyone together and not focusing on making a ton of decisions, but really focusing rather on getting to know each other better, building trust, so that you have that like trust capital, when you are then remote and you're on Slack and things, communication in some ways gets harder. So we're up on time, and this has been a great conversation. It's always a great conversation with you. I hope that I get a chance to invite you back
Sure.
a bit later. We can continue this conversation.
Sounds good.
Super. So with that said, thank you so much, and remember and for all of you listening, if you like this, like and share so more can take part of the conversation. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed that interview. I certainly did. If you want to elevate yourself as a modern leader and help your teams become even more successful, then check out Favro Academy at favro.com. There you will find podcasts, webinars, articles, all free of charge. Check it out.